What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, we are looking at the incredible game, Alireza Firouzja versus Magnus Carlsen from day number 2 of the 2024 Champions Chess Tour Finals. And yes, in the middle game here, Magnus does sacrifice his knight. It is a beautiful tactical shot, so make sure you stick around for that. And here we go. In the game, Alireza Firouzja is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test, and now Magnus does go e5. Now we have knight f3, knight c6, and bishop c4, the Italian opening. And how is Magnus going to respond in this game? Well, he starts knight f6, the two knights defense, putting pressure on that pawn on e4. Now d3 does defend the pawn. That is the main move at the highest level. And now here, Magnus has a choice. The main move as black is going to be bishop c5, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, then going d6, and so on. Now, instead, in the game, he does go bishop e7, and this move is thought to be a little bit more passive than bishop c5, but overall, it is still quite playable. Now here, both sides do castle, castles, and castles. And now here, Alireza, he has a choice. The main moves at the highest level seem to be both knight to c3 and a4, gaining space on the queen side. Now, in the game, he does start knight c3, and this is a very committal move. Typically, in the slow Italian, when black's bishop is on c5, instead of e7, white will go c3, intending d4 at some point later in the game, and perhaps going knight d2, then f1, then g3, and so on. However, with the knight on c3, of course, that knight is occupying c3, and that means white is going to be a lot slower with that plan of, say, c3 and d4. All right, here, Magnus, how does he want to proceed? He starts with the move d6, very solid, and now, of course, with that pawn on e5 defended, black is threatening knight a5, trying to win that bishop, as then, no matter where that bishop goes, it will be captured sooner or later. All right, now here, Alireza, he knows that. The main moves as white are a3 and a4, giving that bishop the retreat square on a2 if it needs it after, say, knight a5. Now in the game, Alireza does go a4, gaining space on the queen side and potentially threatening a5 later in the game. And Magnus, he's having none of that idea. He just goes a5, gaining space on the queen side as well, clamping down on that a5 square, stopping a5 from white. But in the process, he does weaken that b5 square, and that means ideas like bishop b5 could be coming later in the game. All right, Alireza, he continues, rook to e1, a very solid move. And of course here, black is going to have the option of going bishop g4. This may be one of the last times he has the chance to play it, as white is likely going to go h3 in the very near future, maybe even on the next move. Now, bishop g4 is playable, but instead here, Alireza, he just goes h6, guarding that g5 square, stopping knight g5 and bishop g5 ideas. Now here, Magnus, sure enough, h3, guarding g4, stopping bishop g4, and now Alireza, he plays the move rook to e8, a very typical move in the Italian opening, perhaps intending, say, bishop f8, then bishop e6, finally challenging white's Italian bishop on c4. All right, now here, Alireza, he has most of his pieces on very good squares. The only pieces that aren't developed yet include the bishop and the queen on d1, but overall, the bishop on c1 doesn't really have a good square to go to yet. Now, what are white's main ideas to proceed to continue building his position? Well, you can break in the center immediately with d4. That is one idea. Beyond that, you can also go, say, b3, then bishop b2. And finally, there is the other option, which was played in the game of knight to e2, intending knight g3, sort of a different way to get that knight to the g3 square. Of course, typically white goes knight d2, then f1, then g3, but this route also is very playable for white. All right, now here, with that knight on the e2 square instead of c3, it is not controlling the d5 square, and that means black is going to have a very good opportunity to go d5, breaking in the center and opening up the game. Now, d5 is playable, but instead here, Magnus just goes bishop f8, maintaining the tension and keeping the option of d5 open later in the game if he wants it. Now, Alireza, knight to g3 is the move. Very simple, continuing to develop that knight to the better square, and now it does control f5. And from here, Alireza, he may be intending ideas like c3 and d4, trying to gain space in the center. All right, Magnus, again, he has many options here. There is the Italian-style move, bishop e6, challenging white's bishop on c4. That is very, very common in the Italian. But beyond that, you have other ideas, for example, the immediate d5, and even knight to e7, intending knight g6, sort of mirroring white's plan of knight e2, then g3. Now, in the game, Magnus does go bishop e6, challenging white's bishop on c4, very solid. And now white has a choice. Do you want to trade on there or go to b5? That b5 square being weakened by the move a5 played earlier in the game. And that is what white does. Bishop b5, putting pressure on that knight on c6. Of course, now, the idea of going c3 and d4 becomes a lot stronger, as of course, that knight on c6 does control d4, but the bishop can always knock it off whenever it wants to. So now here, Magnus, how does he want to proceed? Well, one option is knight to d7, intending a very fast d5. The point being knight on d7 supports the e5 pawn, meaning you can go d5 without worrying about, say, bishop takes c6, then knight takes e5. And this idea comes up a lot in the main line of the Italian with the bishop on c5 when black goes a5. Now here, instead, Magnus plays a very solid move, bishop d7, retreating the bishop and breaking the pin on the knight to the rook on e8. Now here, Alireza, he knows the main plan for white is to go c3 and d4, and he gets that plan rolling immediately. He starts c3. Now here, Magnus, he goes knight to e7, retreating his knight, and once again offering the trade of bishops. But here, Alireza, he's in no obligation to trade. If black ever takes on b5, then white can recapture with the a pawn. A takes b5, recapturing towards the center, opening up the a file for his rook, and that pawn on b5 would be more of an asset than a weakness. It would put a lot of pressure on black's queen side. So with that in mind here, Alireza, he ignores the bishop and just goes d4, gaining space in the center, a very strong move. And now Alireza clearly is fighting for an opening advantage. He does seem to have the edge so far in the game. All right, now Magnus, how does he want to proceed? Well, the main question is, do you want to trade on b5 or ignore it and continue developing? For example, if you want to ignore it, you can go either c6, then knight g6, or the immediate knight g6, still keeping the tension with those bishops on d7 and b5. Now, instead here, black does trade on b5, bishop takes b5, Magnus opting to trade the bishops, and now we have a takes b5 and e takes d4. Magnus opening up the game. Now, very importantly, white has two main options here, c takes d4 and knight takes. Now, knight takes is the slightly safer option. It's a little bit less ambitious, but it's very hard for things to go wrong for white. Instead, c takes d4 would be the much more ambitious option, The main line going d5, e5, knight e4, trading on e4, winning that pawn, but then black can go queen to d5 at the very end, centralizing his queen and getting very good play for the pawn. Now, instead of going for that here, Alireza, he's playing it safe. He just goes knight takes d4. He's playing against the greatest chess player of all time, so it's hard to blame him for playing it safe here. All right, now Magnus, how does he want to proceed? Well, he's got a few different options. For example, c6 or c5 could be very playable, putting pressure on the queen side immediately, but instead, knight to g6 was played by Magnus. All right, now here, Alireza, c4, gaining space on the queen side, very solid, and maintaining the option of going, say, f4 later in the game if the situation suits it. Now, f4 immediately was also playable, but that is a very committal move. It's hard to blame him for going c4 instead of that. All right, now here, Magnus, c6, trying to get some counterplay on the queen side, and Alireza does trade. We b takes c6, and then b takes c6, and now here, of course, that pawn on c6 is hanging. Alireza, he just jumps in and takes it, knight takes c6, and now here again, he is up a pawn. He does have a small advantage. However, black, Magnus, he seems to think he has some sort of compensation for the pawn, and as we're about to see, he is definitely right in that assumption. All right, queen c7, putting pressure on that knight. Of course, if the knight retreats back to d4, then the pawn on c4 hangs. That would be good for Magnus. So with that in mind here, Alireza, he goes queen to a4, defending that knight and also defending the pawn on c4, allowing a move like knight d4 next if he needs it. However, here, Magnus, he plays a madman's move. The move he plays here is a little bit shocking, but there is a tactical idea behind it. Now, the computer prefers, before I show Magnus Carlsen's move, the computer prefers the move knight d7, intending perhaps knight e5 or knight c5. Those would be very good squares for that knight. Instead here, he actually goes d5, and at first glance, this move looks completely insane. However, there's a very specific idea behind it. Here, white does go c takes d5. Of course, that pawn on e4 is pinned by the rook on e8 to the rook on e1. Therefore, e takes d5 would lose the rook on e1 immediately. So instead, you must recapture with the c pawn. C takes d5. But now here, Magnus, he knows that, and he recaptures with the knight. Knight takes d5, and again, that pawn is pinned. If you capture the knight, you lose the rook on e1, as that rook is under attack by the X-ray attack. So with that in mind here, black does regain the pawn immediately, but he is still down that one pawn, that pawn he lost on c6. All right, now here, Alireza, bishop d2 is the move, developing his bishop, perhaps intending rook c1 or bishop c3, and so on, trying to get his queenside pieces into the game. But here, Magnus, this is where he turns up the heat. He jumps in with this knight to the f4 square, knight d to f4. Of course, the rook on e1 was being defended. That means that knight on d5 was under attack by the pawn. He had to move it. But now this knight is very aggressively placed. Obviously, white has the option of trading it off, but if you do that, the other knight takes its place. That hardly solves the problem, and you would part ways with your very important dark squared bishop. So overall, taking on f4 would not be a particularly good idea. So with that in mind here, what should white be doing? Well, here, Alireza finds the strongest move according to the engine. That is just queen to b5, moving up with the queen, and very importantly, the queen now has access to the king's side via this diagonal. That may be very important. For example, queen to f1 may be a very important resource in the future. Now, here, Magnus, in this position, you know what? Good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the beautiful tactical shot for Magnus right here in this position. And this one is a shocker. You got to calculate very, very deep to justify a move like this. That is my one hit. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here, Magnus, he plays the diabolical madman's move. That is knight takes g2. I mean, this is a Mikhail Tal or a Bobby Fischer style sacrifice right here. I hope I can say that without getting roasted in the comment section, but you know what? Screw it. This is a Bobby Fischer style sacrifice right here. Giving up the knight outright. The point being, for the knight, you win a pawn and you get a very dangerous long-term attack against the white king. All right, here, white obviously takes the knight. That is the critical move. King takes g2. And now, what is the idea behind this knight sacrifice? What is the right follow-up? Well, first of all, you can jump in with the knight right away to h4. That is one very dangerous move. The point being, if you go to, say, like g1 or h2, then immediately knight to f3 forks both the king on either of these squares and the rook on e1. You do win back material right away. And if you don't go to those squares, let's say you go to f1 or h1, then queen d7 hits that pawn on h3, and that would be incredibly dangerous. So knight h4 immediately is one idea. Instead, Magnus plays actually a stronger move than that. Simply queen d7 immediately, putting that immediate pressure on that pawn on h3, and now threatening knight h4. And then if you go king h2 defending the pawn, then of course knight f3 again forks literally everything in the white position. And beyond that, of course, the queen on d7 also hits that bishop on d2. So a very strong multi-purpose move. All right, now, of course, you must defend that bishop. You can't allow queen takes d2. So with that in mind, Alireza, what should he be doing here? Well, he's got two good squares for the bishop, e3 and c3. Where's it going to go? Well, turns out c3 is actually the strongest square for the bishop right here, but instead in the game, bishop e3 was played. All right, now here, Magnus, of course, he continues knight h4, jumping in with the knight. Now the king must move. Of course, if you go to, say, g1 or h2, then again, knight f3 forks both the king on h2 or g1 and the rook on e1. Instead here, king to f1 is played, but of course, that does give up that pawn on h3. Now, you can take it immediately, but instead here, Magnus, he plays the intermediate move, simply rook a to b8, putting more pressure on that queen. All right, the queen must move. It goes to d5, offering the queen trade. And of course, Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT, he declines. Queen takes h3 is the move, hitting the king with check. All right, the king is under check here. Alireza king to e2, getting out of the check. And now we have rook takes b2, flying in with the rook once again, hitting that king on the e2 square. Now king d3 again, Alireza trying to run away with the king. But Magnus, we can clearly see now, he is getting quite a vicious attack for that knight. Now he has 1-2 pawns and the attack for the knight, and the attack continues. All right, knight g2, jumping down with the knight, pressuring the bishop and the rook. Now here, Alireza, rook to e2, getting the rook out of the attack and trying to defend. Of course, now, you want to keep that rook alive. It is very important. If you just take the rook on e2, then after knight takes e2, white is defending, and he does have a very large advantage. So with that in mind here, Magnus, he knows that. He slides back with the rook to b7, winning that free pawn on b2, then getting his tail out of there. All right, now, Alireza, queen to f5, offering the queen trade yet again, and yet again, Magnus does decline. Queen to h4, keeping the queens on the board and keeping the attack going. Now we have rook to h1, sliding over with the rook being defended by that knight on g3. So now the queen must move. Now here, the best intermediate move for black, it turns out, is actually the move rook to d8. The point being, after rook d8, white actually cannot take that rook. It is a poison rook. The point being, after knight takes, queen takes, then black gets a vicious attack on these open files against the white king. For example, if white blocks bishop d4, then rook d7, and both the queen and the rook are lining up against that bishop on d4, that would be extremely dangerous. However, instead of finding that move here, Magnus does go knight takes e3, opting not to go rook d8, perhaps not calculating everything out in time. And now here, Alireza, he has to make a choice. Either rook takes, king takes, or f takes e3. Now, it turns out king takes is the right move, but instead, rook takes e3 played in the game. Now here, Magnus, queen to g5, offering the queen trade under favorable circumstances, and we do have an endgame after queen takes, then h takes. Now here, again, white is up a full piece. He has the 2 knights versus the 1 bishop of black. However, Magnus is up 2 pawns. He has 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns versus the 2 pawns of Alireza. It's going to be anyone's game in this endgame. All right, now here, white. The strongest move here is simply e5, gaining space in the center, but instead, Alireza immediately captures that pawn on a5. Knight takes a5, and this turns out to be a little bit dubious. Now Magnus, rook d8, hitting the king, then king e2 retreating, and now rook b2. Black is piling up the pressure. Now king to f3, then bishop c5, hitting that rook on the e3 square. It's amazing how in all of these games, Magnus always seems to find ways to get all of his pieces just so tremendously active, doing so much against his opponent. All right, now here, Alireza, how does he respond? Well, it turns out you actually have to give up the rook on e3. If you try to defend with, say, I don't know, rook to c3, something like that, then a rook takes f2 is quite deadly. Now, instead here, knight to c4 was played, the best defensive move, supporting the rook on e3 as well as targeting black's rook on the b2 square. Now here, Magnus, he sees this, he just goes rook c2, putting pressure on that knight and virtually forcing the knight to move yet again. Now we have knight to e5, centralizing the knight, and now here Magnus finally does trade on e3. We have bishop takes e3, and now, very importantly, if white did go king takes e3, that would be a mistake, as the follow-up move is rook to e8, and black would have a lot of pressure on the e-file. Instead here, Alireza, he sees that, and he actually goes f takes e3, opting to damage his own pawn structure to keep his king a little bit safer. A very smart move, it turns out. Now here, Magnus, the Ben Feingold move f6, Ben Feingold's favorite move on the board. It hits the knight must move. We have knight to g4, and now a slight inaccuracy in the endgame, king to f7. The stronger move was rook d to c8, doubling up rooks on the c-file. Instead, king to f7 played in the game. Now we have e5, gaining space, Alireza opting to try and trade off some pawns on the king side. Now we have king to e6, e takes, and g takes. And again, Alireza, he's still ahead. He's still going to have decent winning chances in this endgame. And it continues rook to h6, putting pressure on that weak pawn on f6. Now we have rook to f8 defending, then knight to e4, jumping up with the knight. Now we have 1, 2, 3 attackers of that pawn on f6 versus the 1, 2 defenders. How is black going to defend? Well, here he goes, king to e7, just giving up that pawn. And now, sure enough, we have some trades. Rook takes, then knight e takes f6. And now here, white, of course, has the 2 knights versus the rook of black. Normally, those 2 knights would give white an advantage. However, the computer seems to think here it is a roughly even endgame. All right, let's see how it continues. King to e6 for black, then knight to e4, jumping back with the knight. Then we have rook to a2, sliding over with the rook, knight g to f2, and then g4 check, giving up the pawn, but hitting the king in the process. Now here, white does take that pawn. King takes g4. What is Magnus Carlsen's idea? He goes rook to a3, putting pressure on that pawn on e3. I think Magnus here is just fighting for a draw. The computer seems to think he actually has some sort of winning chances here. All right, knight d3, giving up a knight outright. We have rook takes d3, and then knight to c5, jumping back with the knight, pressuring the rook. Now, of course, the king is under check. We have king to e5, and knight takes d3 check, hitting the king. And now, of course, white is up a full knight and the pawn. However, here, Magnus, he just goes king to e4, pressuring both the knight and the pawn, and it turns out there is no way to defend that pawn on e3. Now, if white could move the knight back, say, 2 squares to d2 in one go, that would be a completely winning endgame for white. However, unfortunately, that is not possible. White moves the knight, knight to f2, black captures the pawn, king takes e3, and now here we have a draw as white does not have enough material to force a checkmate. You cannot mate with just a single knight, and therefore both sides are forced to agree to a draw on the spot. Wow, what a shocker of a game between Alireza Firouzja and Magnus Carlsen in day number 2 of the 2024 Champions Chess Tour Finals. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here, where I covered one of Magnus Carlsen's best games from day number 1 of the 2024 Champions Chess Tour Finals. That game was incredible. Check it out. I'm sure you're going to love it, and I'll see you in the next video.